Funding for Detroit Remember When is provided by the Detroit Free Press. Additional funding is provided by Albert Kahn Associates Incorporated, the Earl Beth Foundation, Gannett Outdoor, and the Helen L. DeRoy Foundation.
Remember when the streets of Detroit were lined with elm trees? Remember when you first saw the giant stove on Jefferson? Or the biggest flag in the world outside Hudson's? Remember when you rode the Woodward streetcar downtown for a day of shopping? And remember when everyone met under the Kern's clock? Well, meet us once more under the Kern's clock as we go back in time to look at Detroit. Remember when? Throughout our history, Detroit has been known by many names. At the turn of the century, our tree-lined streets made us the Paris of the Midwest, and the place where life is worth living. Henry Ford and others like him made Detroit the Motor City, but it was the men on the line who fought and won respect for the workers. During World War II, patriots proudly called Detroit the arsenal of democracy. And in the 60s, music lovers around the world knew us as Motown. But when we remember Detroit, it's the shared good times that trigger our fondest memories, the places, the events, or sometimes just the season.
Summer in Detroit was hot. There was no air conditioning when I was a kid. Your home wasn't air conditioned. So you had to find places to go to get cool, particularly on the weekends. I went with my mom and dad and brother, and we'd go down on a Saturday night very often, or some other hot summer night, and go to Vernor's. As I remember it, it was kind of a big open room with counters, and you went up and you got a Boston cooler or a cream soda. Again, all kinds of things to do to beat the heat on hot summer nights, because it was a little cooler down by the river.
The one that I remember was on Woodward. I don't remember exactly where, but it was a treat in the summertime. They used to line up outside to get the cream ales. You could see them bottle the ginger ale there. You could get a cream ale. It was just something to do.
I always wondered why it was called Boston Cooler. Never did have the answer to that. I mean, it's Detroit, so what's that got to do with Boston? I wouldn't have the slightest idea.
For many, summer meant a trip to their favorite amusement park. Originally built by the streetcar companies, the amusement parks gave passengers a reason to ride when it wasn't rush hour.
Well, the amusement park, it was like a miniature Coney Island. They had the Ferris wheel, the carousels, but they also had the sideshows. The best prizes you could win at that time was a Cupid doll. I remember my uncle he was a sucker for those games, and he had a Cupid doll on his dresser at home.
I remember about the summers of Detroit, the fun things were the going to Boblo Island for one. I remember going down, taking the island rides in, and then coming back on the night boat. And everybody had a lot of fun, but usually by the time you got back to Woodward, you were beat out, tired.
On the east side, the most popular amusement park was Jefferson Beach. Opened on July 2nd of 1927, Jefferson Beach featured many of the rides originally found at Electric Park, which was closed in the mid-20s by neighbors who protested to the bad behavior and manners of the people who went there. Jefferson Beach was the largest amusement park in the state of Michigan, advertising the longest roller coaster in the country. It also had the benefit of having a bathing beach on Lake St. Clair for cooling off after a hot day on the rides. Jefferson Beach's goal was to provide clean, safe, wholesome outdoor recreation for everybody, to fill the hearts of children with joy while spending their hours of play in the sunshine and fresh air, to send every man, woman, and child home feeling that the time had been well spent and eager to return. For those looking for a more relaxing afternoon, Detroit offered many beautiful parks, such as Palmer Park.
Well, Palmer Park was very close to our house. It was a place that you could go and sit by the duck pond. And there was the day that I fell into that. I was all of 5 years old, and I was trying to feed the ducks and fell in, got all soaked. So it's sort of a family memory.
A unique attraction at Palmer Park was the log cabin, which fascinated and scared many a visitor.
I remember it being there, but it looked creepy to me. You know, I mean, it just looked real dark and creepy, even though that was the time of Davy Crockett and all of this. But, you know, I didn't go in the log cabin. I don't know why. Creepy.
The log cabin was built in 1885 on land owned by Senator Thomas W. Palmer, then a U.S. Senator from Michigan. He built it for his wife Lizzie as a country retreat and for entertaining guests far from the hectic Detroit life. By the 1890s, Senator Palmer noticed more and more visitors picnicking on his land and admiring his log cabin. In 1893, he donated the land to Detroit and the log cabin shortly after, commenting, "After I was dead, I thought I would like to look down and see the boys and girls around here." The park was called Log Cabin Park for a few years, but was renamed Palmer Park in 1897. But of all the parks in Detroit, there is one that brings out the most pleasant memories: Belle Isle.
My uncle would pick us up. He was the only one in the family that had a car. We would go about 8 in the car and go to Belle Isle. At that time, there was a wooden bridge before the bridge that there is now, the canoes. That was the wildest dreams of every young girl there. They had green canoes for rent, which were very ordinary. But the joy was if you could ever get a ride in one of the private canoes. They were all decked out in colorful pillows. And they had a Victrola. And I think the most popular song at that time was 5'2", Eyes of Blue and Sleepy Time Gal. You could probably hear it on every Victrola. And it was the envy of all the girls.
Summer in Detroit means Belle Isle, the weeping willow trees, the sun on the water, the people in the park. I mean, and then, of course, later on in high school, making out as a place to make out. But, you know, it was just magical.
Fond as our recollections are of June, July, and August, summer memories eventually turn into the remembrances of autumn, with hints of the coming ice and snow. In many places, people curse the coming of winter. In Detroit, we welcome it with a parade.
The thing I remember most about Christmas in Detroit was the big parade at Thanksgiving time that the Hudson's department store used to sponsor.
When I took my children down, and a friend of mine also had a large family, and we would take 2 stepladders. And we would set up these 2 stepladders, and we had the extension, the painter's extension, going between them. And we put the smallest children up on the extension so that they could see everything.
The big thing was standing down there in the cold and watching all the bands in the parade, and then seeing Santa show up at the very end. It was always right out in the front of Hudson's with the castle on the marquee and the big Christmas tree up on the side of the building. It's the kind of thing you never really forget about.
Joseph L. Hudson opened his first store in 1881 on the ground floor of the Detroit Opera House near the City Hall. When the Opera House was remodeled in 1887, he temporarily moved the store to a location west of Woodward, between Michigan and State. 1 year later, he purchased 13,000 square feet at Gratiot and Farmer and began to build the store of his dreams. By the end of the 1940s, Hudson's had grown to one of the world's largest department stores.
I don't think that at that period of time there was another store in the United States that provided all the services that the J.L. Hudson Company did. If you wanted a package gift wrapped, it was done right in front of you. And you have to remember that there was no Scotch tape at that time. And one of their rules when they trained their help was that you never left a sharp edge of paper exposed because someone might get a paper cut.
But our favorite memories of Hudson's are closely tied to Christmas.
When I was a child, my father always took us on a special Christmas drive. We would go downtown and circle the jail Hudson building. Hudson's would decorate their windows with Christmas scenes and animated characters that would be moving. We would make a slow circle around the Hudson's building a couple of times. And of course, we always wanted my dad to go one more time. And it wasn't a difficult thing to do because there were lots of other families circling the jail Hudson building in the evening to see the windows.
The crowds downtown were 4 and 5 bodies at least across the sidewalks. And they mobbed the streets to keep people under control. There was a traffic control person somewhere, and no one could ever figure out where, but they must have been up on the 3rd, 4th, 5th floor somewhere, and they had a large microphone. And sometimes you would try to cut across the street and you would hear a voice boom out, "The lady in the blue coat with the little girl, would you please use the crosswalk, don't jaywalk, we can ticket you." And of course immediately everybody would get in line again. People would go to look in the windows, even if they didn't go in. But how could you not go in when you saw the things that were being offered?
As a child, I remember the 12th floor. That was a toy department, and you could get on an elevator anytime in the month of December and fly up to the 12th floor and just enjoy. That's where the real Santa Claus lived.
As a little kid, this is a wonderland. I mean, there were Christmas trees, the decorations at Hudson's were magnificent, and then there was a whole section where you went to see Santa Claus. And you got to remember that a lot of us believed in Santa Claus in those days. In fact, I still believe in Santa Claus.
You'd get to the end of or the head of the line, and there would be a room, and then you would be ushered in to see Santa. Later on, when I worked at Hudson's, when I was older, I discovered that there were more than one room to go see Santa and more than one Santa to keep this line moving. But of course, as a child, I didn't know that. I thought that Santa was just waiting in this room especially to see me.
And then, if you were a boy, you immediately headed over to the train department because they had a model train layout that was just killer.
Hudson's also had a fabulous doll department. They'd have the dolls in their big hoop skirts and their fancy dresses.
This was the wonder of the day, the wonder of the season between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Children going up to the 12th floor, and all of a sudden being in a wonderland. Everything was sparkling, everything was moving. There was anything that a child could possibly want to have, to see, or to experience.
Hudson's wasn't the only place to see fabulous Christmas displays. Out in Dearborn, people would flock to the Ford Rotunda.
It was a marvelous building. Plus, at night when you go by, there were rings around the top of this building, and they had colored lights in them. And it was just like a beacon that you were coming in. It was Buck Rogers plopped down in Dearborn, Michigan. It was the Emerald City. The only thing missing was Oz, but it was there. Dr. Oz was not there, but it was there. I guess Mr. Ford would be Oz.
Mr. Ford first commissioned the rotunda for the 1934 Chicago World's Fair. It was designed by the famous Detroit architect, Albert Kahn. In 1936, Henry Ford had the rotunda moved to Dearborn to serve as a visitor center and gateway to the River Rouge Ford factory. Gas rationing during World War II prohibited visitors from driving all the way to Dearborn, so the rotunda was temporarily closed. But in June of 1953, as the Ford Motor Company was celebrating its 50th anniversary, the rotunda once again opened to the public, featuring a brand new sign and a geodesic dome.
It was set on lawn. There was a lawn that you went up to, and there was an area that you parked in the back, as I recall. And you walked around and you went into this front door, and there was the future. I believe that that was truly Henry Ford's vision, because when I drive down Ford Road and I come into Dearborn, where they have all the high-rises, where the Ford Glass House is, and all these new buildings that they've put up, and I say, my God, I lived the future in the rotunda in that display, because here it is today.
The most popular exhibits at the Rotunda were the annual holiday displays between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Christmas at the Rotunda soon became a Detroit and Dearborn tradition.
When I was a child, I would go to the Ford Rotunda just about every year during the Christmas season with a group. It would be the Brownie Troop or my school class or some kind of organization, because going to the Ford Rotunda at Christmas time was a really special event. They had all of the displays and again the animated characters and the Christmas scenes, and I just remember it being wall-to-wall people. We always had our rope to hang on to with our school group and or our Brownie Troop, and the kids were, we had to hang on to that rope or else we would get lost, and they didn't have to tell us twice once we got in there, because you knew you'd get lost if you got let go of that rope.
On Friday, November 9th, 1962, as workmen were beginning to set up that year's holiday spectacular, a fire broke out shortly after 1 p.m. as workers were waterproofing the dome. The alarm was sounded at 1:12, and despite a heroic effort by the entire Dearborn Fire Brigade, the walls of the Rotunda collapsed at 1:55 in the afternoon. Fortunately, no one was hurt. In 1974, a new Ford Guest Center was built near Greenfield Village, ending dreams that the Rotunda would rise again. No matter how cold it got in the winter, however, there was always one place where the action was hot: Olympia.
My name's Bob Wimmer, and I've been with the Wings since the 50s. Did a lot of their photography work. Also wrote for the Red Wing programs, and I was just a general rink rat around the Olympia Stadium until it closed.
My name is Bernie Opoleski, and I've been with Olympia for about as long as I can remember. I was raised in that building. At one time, there was about 8 or 10 of us at the building. My family, there was my dad, 2 older brothers, worked there as ushers along with my dad and myself. And then I had 2 brother-in-laws that worked as ushers, 3 nephews worked as ushers.
My name is Larry Kasiba, and I ushered at Olympia since 1964 till it closed in 1980. People would say that the first or second row of the balcony was probably the best seat in the house because it hung over the action more or less rather than being back.
You hung right over the crowd. You could be up in the balcony, in the upper balcony as we called it then, all the way up. Mezzanine, whatever they wanted to call it. But you felt like you were part of the action.
People used to sit in the aisles. That's how close it was. You got a standing room seat. As soon as the game started, zoom. You got the aisle was wide enough for 2 people, so one side would be people sitting and the other walking.
The fans in the 50s and especially the 60s when I worked, coming to a Red Wing game was almost like going to an evening at the theater. I remember in those days it was quite a thing to get dressed up and come and go to the game.
Detroit won its first Stanley Cup in 1936, but it was in the 50s that the Wings ruled the National Hockey League, finishing first 8 times out of 9 years and winning the Stanley Cup 4 times. They were box office magic, partly due to Detroit's production line, featuring Ted Lindsay.
Ted Lindsay was sort of a short guy.
Short fuse, short in stature, tall in results.
Yeah, he had a stick in his hand, and once you got rid of yours and he got rid of his, look out, there it comes. And the guy was always after somebody. Win at all costs was Ted's motto.
Captain Sid Abel.
What I remember of him was the fact that he was a great playmaker on the line with Teddy and Gord. And I think if you were to question Ted or Gord about it today, they would probably state the same thing, that Sid set up a lot of their goals. He was very well liked around the league as far as the hockey player was concerned.
And of course, Gordie Howe.
Derek Sanderson used to say, he was, don't check Howe, whatever you do, when Boston would come into town, because he said, leave the sleeping giant alone. Don't rile him up. We may sneak in and steal 2 points. And sure enough, some rookie would try to take him out or run into him, and he'd get his dander up, and then they wouldn't get the 2 points, and they'd also be carrying a rookie out or bandaged up at least. The interesting thing is, just a great guy. He would take the time to stop and talk with the guys in the parking lot, even on the way in, and go up to those steps and do just as well and be just as cordial to, you know, the movers and shakers of the city. I mean, he got along with, you know, from the rank and file all the way up to the politicians and movers and shakers. So just a great guy. But on the ice, obviously the best player that ever played, I think.
The Red Barn wasn't only the home of the Red Wings. The rodeo was one of the first events here, and boxing was one of the first commercial successes, featuring Detroit's own Joe Louis. The Harlem Globetrotters would make regular stops at Olympia, as well as the Ice Follies, featuring Sonia Henney. Another popular event was wrestling.
I'll never forget, my dad and I were working a wrestling match one night, and this little lady, if she stood 5 foot tall, it weighed 70 pounds, that was putting on a heck of a lot. And she had a front row seat, and she was after Dick the Bruiser that night. And Bruiser come out of the ring and made a gesture towards her, and she got angry and swung. And to this day, I can remember my dad saying he don't know if she had a brick in that purse or a fully loaded bottle in that purse, but when she swung, he caught it instead of Dick the Bruiser, and his wrist was swelled for about a week thereafter.
In its 53 years of existence, 60 million people attended the wide variety of events at Olympia. Sadly, though, in 1986, the Red Barn was torn down.
When this building died, I think a piece of myself and my family went with it. As I say, born and raised in this building. My dad was here from the day they put it up. He died in the building, on the job working, the day he passed away. At the time, he had 48 years in the building. And so, yeah, when Olympia went, a big piece of our family went with it.
Coming up, we'll take a trip down Woodward on the streetcars. Look at music in Detroit from Greystone to Motown. Plus, 4 boys from Liverpool come to Olympia when we return to Detroit. Remember when?
Olympia Stadium, I guess most everybody remembers as the great hockey palace. That really was what it was built for. But there were a lot of other things that were shown there that people remember, the fights and the special concerts. And I particularly remember one show in '65, I think it was, when the Beatles played. A friend of mine had a couple of tickets. And he said, "Do you want to go?" I says, "I wouldn't miss that for anything."
In 1964, when the Beatles first announced they were going to tour America, Olympia promoter Nick Landis immediately booked the Beatles for 3 performances on a single Sunday at $20,000 a performance. All 3 shows sold out, drawing over 50,000 people. Other cities tried to make the same deal, but failed.
The biggest part of the show wasn't watching the Beatles, which you couldn't hear them anyway, for all the screaming in the audience. It was watching all these people trying to crash on that stage and go up there with the police trying to hold them back, and thousands of flash bulbs going off. It was the funniest thing I ever saw.
I mean, it could have been the 3 of us and somebody else singing in the background. Nobody would have heard it. All you heard is this loud yell or squeal for the whole 15 minutes that they were on. That was it. You couldn't hear anything else.
The one thing I'll never forget, one of the concerts, a gal jumped out of the balcony. For whatever reason, she was trying to get to the stage, or maybe it was a little high, or who knows what, but poor guy she landed on in a lower arena took the brunt of the jump, and I guess they just patched her up a little bit, and she went merrily on her way.
The whole town for a couple of days was going bananas about the Beatles. The hotel they stayed at, and I can't remember the place on Jefferson, the Whittier, they took the carpets out of there and cut them up into pieces and sold them for souvenirs that the Beatles walked on this carpet.
Music has always played an important part in our memories of Detroit. In the 30s and 40s, the big band sound dominated the scene, and one of the places to go was the Greystone Ballroom.
The ballroom was a marvelous place. I never went there a great deal, but I did go to the Greystone Ballroom. They had an outside garden, the Greystone Garden, and it was just plain old-fashioned fun. It was just fun.
No, I never went to the Greystone Ballroom. The girls, it seemed that the girls didn't go to the Greystone Ballroom, but the boys went and told everybody about the Greystone Ballroom.
The Greystone is no longer with us. However, on the corner of Jefferson and Newport, you can still find the Vanity Ballroom.
I'm Rebecca Binno. I'm with the Detroit Area Art Deco Society, and here we are at the Vanity Ballroom. Let's go back in time to 1929. You and your date just took the streetcar up Jefferson and stopped at Newport. You'd have got off and noticed the Harry Suffren's clothing store, Friedberg's jewelry store, Burns' shoe store, and a women's clothing store. At the corner of Jefferson and Newport is a Cunningham's drugstore. As you walked to the Vanity Ballroom, you would have noticed some of the architectural details that gave you a hint to the interior design inside. The stylized Mayan Indian heads, the running jaguars, and green glazed tiles all give you an idea of what's inside the Vanity. But mostly you would have noticed the large neon sign that read Vanity Dancing. As you enter the Vanity Ballroom, you're transported from your working class blue-collar job in Detroit into an exotic, romantic Aztec temple. Architects in the 1920s and 30s were able to design movie palaces and ballrooms into whatever architectural style they chose, whether it was Aztec or Siamese. The architect of the Vanity Ballroom, Charles Agri, chose the Aztec, Mayan, Mexican influence combined with the Art Deco style. An example of that is the stepped archway from what we now call Art Deco with the Mayan and Aztec symbols. He applied those symbols to the light fixtures, the chandeliers, the benches, the tables, and the chandelier plaques on the ceiling, all to create the Mayan Aztec theme of the Vanity. Here we are on the dance floor of the Vanity Ballroom. This dance floor is 5,600 square feet. The Vanity was advertised as having a floating ballroom. And what that actually means is it's spring-loaded, so there are actual springs underneath to give the dancers resistance as they danced. Now, one special thing at the Vanity is it was a very respectable place to go, and there were floormen stationed all around the dance floor. They supervised and watched the dancers. That's because suggestive dancing was not allowed. And when I asked a manager what that meant, he said, "No wiggling of the butt." Well, after you and your partner danced here, you might go to one of the soda counters on either side and have a glass of Vernor's ginger ale or a lemonade or ice cream sundae. That's because liquor was not served here at the Vanity. Well, the Vanity survives as Detroit's last intact remaining ballroom. And I absolutely believe 100% that it could go back to its former splendor and grandeur that it used to have.
Big bands like Cab Calloway or Count Basie would often perform at the Greystone or Vanity Ballrooms, but afterwards they would head to the Valley.
Paradise Valley was named from a contest that was run by a theatrical booking agent named Rollo Vest. And they had a contest to name it, and the name was Paradise Valley. Now, Paradise Valley had 17 bars and restaurants, clubs, etc., that were owned by blacks. You'd have to go to Las Vegas to see anything similar to what they had in Paradise Valley.
Henry Ford's $5 a day job offer started a major migration to the Detroit area. On arriving to Detroit, however, most blacks found the only section available to them for housing was an area called Black Bottom, a neighborhood named for its soil, not its inhabitants. Still, in the mid-30s, most restaurants and places of entertainment were not open to black residents. So Paradise Valley was formed, filled with businesses owned and operated by blacks. Most famous in the Valley were the nightclubs, featuring elaborate shows with equally elegant showgirls.
It was glamorous. It really was. It was huge. We had our dressing room. We had our what is it? The lady that dressed us, took care of our costumes.
Wardrobe mistress.
We had a wardrobe mistress, just like in Hollywood. Costumes, gorgeous.
From Lester's in Chicago.
In Chicago, right. Shoes to match every color you wanted.
Usually, the chorus line opened up the show. Okay, so they might have a singer behind the chorus line, which was us. And they had a singer behind the chorus line. Then maybe they'll throw in a little comic somewhere there. Then we do another number, say like, they call it the middle number.
Or the production number.
Or the production. And we're just fabulous and all of this. and then they'll have the acts after that. Then whoever's on the show close the show. Then we do it from there.
There were 2 shows nightly and a matinee on Sunday.
Packed. Every night. We danced every night in the week.
How often did you come in on time?
Oh, that's good. Never on
I
time,
was
man.
always late.
Material.
Material.
We have to help her with her shoes. This one has to put the eyelashes on. She's got to put this on. And the music. And she said, where did it go? This is my girl here. But this is not too far behind. Okay.
The waiters used to bet on me. You know.
About whether you were going to make it or not.
Make it or not,
Yeah, we had a good time.
But I would make it.
Not far from the Valley was a place where the greatest black entertainers performed, the Paradise Theater.
My love for show business started right here in Orchestra Hall when it was the Paradise Theater. And it opened on December the 31st, 1941 with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And the first time I came here and looked at that stage and saw all the lights and all the reds and greens, and I was totally fascinated and I was hooked for life. Anybody who was anybody in the black music world came to the Paradise Theater. And right down the street, 1 block from here, was the Gotham Hotel, which was known as the finest hotel in the world for black people, because at that time, black people could not stay in the hotels downtown.
They had a dining room downstairs, you know, and everybody after the shows, they would come there and eat. Then the men had a big old room upstairs with no ladies allowed.
Called the Pit House.
And them they didn't allow none of us. We go, I'm sorry.
It's hard to describe the magic, the feeling that there was no stranger there. You met no stranger in Paradise Valley, you know, from whether a person was a gambler or maybe even a crook, or, you know, or just a professional person. You know, people mixed.
By the 1950s, big band music was disappearing and rock and roll was beginning. In the 60s, the new generation had a new style of music to express their point of view, and the meeting place for this new generation became the Grande Ballroom.
The Grande was on Grand River and Joy Road, actually, and but it was, if you want the specific street, it was on Beverly. That's where you entered, on Beverly and Grand River. It had been a very successful big band place years ago, starting, I think, back maybe in the 20s, 30s, and then it fell into disuse back in the 50s. And in fact, when I took it over, it had been for a while a roller skating arena. And then they were storing mattresses there when I actually took it over. It was the home of a lot of famous bands. The MC5 got their start there. Iggy Pop got their start. The first time The Who played Tommy was on the stage of the Grande Ballroom. A lot of people don't know that. You know, they claim it was out east.
The Grande Ballroom was a wonderful place for me as a teenager to go. At the time, I was going to Cass Tech High School, which was downtown. And I was growing my hair long, which was the thing to do. This was the late 1960s. One thing that I really still am amazed about is that the Grande would bring in the highest caliber international acts that there were. And I remember there was a fire marshal sign that indicated the capacity was only 2,500 people. Where now it seems like the national, international acts will fill up the Silver Dome.
The talent had to come up the main stairway, just where the people came in. And then their dressing rooms were very accessible, so people could talk to them. And the stage, you were right there. In other words, we took a lot of the restrictions of traditional theater and shows away. We didn't use chairs. You just stood around or sat on the floor, okay? And as I say, you could move around the ballroom. My door was always open. People would come into the office. There was nothing off limits. I remember the time that B.B. King came in and he was going to play, and Alice Cooper was going to be on the bill also. And I had made a mistake. On the contract, I had given Alice top billing and B.B. King top billing. So B.B. comes in without a manager. I mean, he just comes on in, and he comes on upstairs. Hi, Russ, how are you? And I said, well, B.B., can you come in the office? Man, we got a little problem here. And I tried to explain to him, and he said, what's the problem? I said, well, B.B., you know, you both signed contracts in the South. He said, that's no problem. He said, I'll play first, whatever you want. He said, I don't care where you put me on. He says, Russ, I'll blow those white boys away. And you know what? He did.
When I played at the Grandie, if anyone ever had 15 minutes of fame, I think that was probably my 15 minutes of fame. I remember walking out on the stage and just thinking about all the acts that I had seen play on that same stage. It was a place where you could go and have long hair and kind of show it off and see other people that had long hair. There was always a light show behind all the acts. I think it was called the Trans Love Light Show. So there was always something to watch, something going on. It felt like being a part of something. I still talk about playing the Grandie as, you know, having been the pinnacle of my rock and roll career.
The music that was played at the Vanity, or Paradise Valley, or even the Grandie Ballroom was all imported from other cities: New York, New Orleans, San Francisco. In the 60s, it was time for Detroit to come up with its own sound, and it was called Motown.
The Motown sound from Berry Gordy, first it reminded you of the factory line because it was a consistent beat, an undercurrent beat. And then they had cute little words like my girl and sugar pie honey bunch and all those kinds of things to say a people have finally arrived to be happy, to be excited, and to be young again. We could hear the music. You could hear the gospel music. You could hear the jazz. You could hear all of the different kinds of show music. Detroit to me is a lady, you know, she's a woman. And she reached out and got the immigrants from Europe, the migrants from the South, the poor from Appalachia, and she brought them on in and put them together and made a melting pot. And from all of this different diversity, what happened was a new sound, a new spirit that's telling a new story and making a great statement.
During the Motown review, my job was to introduce the artist. You bring the artist on, you bring the artist off, and in between time, you know, if you had to, as they say, stretch, you probably had a clean joke you could tell or something about who was coming up with that kind of thing. So I was more or less the MC of the show. It was at the Fox Theater, ran about 10 days during the Christmas and New Year period. You'd have anywhere from 12 to 15 of your nationally known acts and some of the up-and-coming acts. And they would perform a complete show. And many times it was, I think it cost like $1.50 to get in. And you got a chance to see the Marvin Gayes, the Stevie Wonders.
My fondest memory of Motown, I would say, was the camaraderie, I guess, of all of the people that were connected to Motown. That meant the promotion people, the musicians, the artists, the secretaries, the janitors. It was one big family. Everybody in Detroit was a Motown star. One of the things that I remember when I got to the city was the kind of pride that everybody had in the city. A guy who was a janitor any place would be walking around and you would have thought that he was a Motown star because of the pride that he had. I mean, Motown is Detroit.
We all have our favorite memories of Detroit, whether it's the department stores, or the movie theaters, the parks, or even the ice cream fountains. But what connects us to all these places might be what connected them in the past. The streetcars.
I remember about the streetcars that it cost 6 cents to ride, and the transfer was 1 penny.
You had to run out to the center island to get on the thing and avoid all the cars, just getting out to where you boarded the thing. Then the thing would take off, and they had kind of a direct drive. So when they floored the things, I mean, they'd throw you backwards. They were fast, and when they got going, everybody got out of their way. They're really fun, with the bells clanging and the sparks flying off the top.
The politeness of the conductor, the brass gleaming in the daytime and in the early twilight, the ding, ding, ding of the bell. It was like going on an adventure every time you got on one, and the beautiful gleaming glass. I mean, they were just very elegant.
As you got closer to the downtown area, once you passed the David Whitney building, you had Russicks and you had Grinnell's, you had DJ Healy's, they had Siegel's. Frank and Cedars used to be on Woodward Avenue. There was one restaurant called the Ambassador that made the greatest grilled cheese sandwich you ever wanted to eat. It was an open-faced grilled cheese sandwich. You don't think a grilled cheese is so unusual, but theirs was unusual.
The neat thing was it went all the way, if you stayed on the Woodward car, went all the way out to 8 Mile Road and turned around, right at the city limits. And I remember riding them just for the fun of it, because I was such a streetcar fanatic at the time. Just got on a ride out there, go out and ride back, just to be riding on the things.
I never thought of the streetcars as romantic or wonderful until I found out that they were going to disappear. And my children were very young when they took the last Woodward cars off the line. So we went down and everybody got a ride on the streetcar. I'm not sure they remember that very much, but I sure do.
It has been suggested that when we reflect upon the past, we enlarge what is no longer there. Could the giant stove and Hudson's flag really be that big? Were summers at Jefferson Beach and ice skating on Belle Isle really more fun back then? Was music really sweeter at the Vanity or in the Valley? In the final analysis, perhaps it is not the places or things that count the most in our memories. Maybe it's the people with whom we shared the good times, our families, our friends, or even complete strangers. Thank you for sharing some of your time with us tonight and helping us remember when.
Funding for Detroit Remember When is provided by the Detroit Free Press. Additional funding is provided by Albert Kahn Associates Incorporated, the Earl Beth Foundation, Gannett Outdoor, and the Helen L. DeRoy Foundation.